came back to Afghanistan. And we were like, as I mentioned, that Malaiz was my mentor, from the beginning. And then we were working as part of a very young leaders forum, and who were always having like big dreams for Afghanistan. And what happened that I followed Malaiz as once Malaiz left Afghanistan, the office of Ghani. So I worked as chief of staff for Ashraf Ghani, and before that I also used to work with different ministries and with the election commission, with United Nations, with several other government offices, including the office of the spokesperson, where we met actually in India in 2009. So I also saw the boat that was sinking a little bit later than Malaiz. So I left the government in 2012. I saw that the vision that we had for Afghanistan was not like, our goals were not aligned with the vision that we had for Afghanistan. So that's why I chose to, leave the government and start working for private sector and see in order to generate, because I saw that we should focus more a little bit on young generation. And so from there, now when I see this, that after 1 year, that we actually collectively failed. It's not only one person or two persons who failed Afghanistan. It is like all of us, because we couldn't, we were not like, smart enough to put all these pieces together to, rescue Afghanistan. So now we are back to the square one after 20 years. And we see that, Taliban is taking over, actually closing the schools and, denying women from their rights, and almost every citizen from the citizenship right. This will be the basic, in part that everyone has to focus, that whether the people of Afghanistan is having their citizenship right or not.
Mm. So let's thank you for your early reflections, and it just sets the nice pace, for this interview. I want to begin a deeper inquiry into what led to the collapse, and I want to begin with you, Malaiz, because as Chief of Staff of President Ghani, very early on in 2012, you have said that you already saw the first signs of the ship sinking. It took 10 years for that to happen. In what way do you think Ghani facilitated this collapse? Was it just a matter of leadership failure, or do you think Ghani was proactively facilitating a collapse?
Well, the problem is it was not only the leadership failure. Obviously, leadership played a central role in it, but overall, the way I see the history of this country and the history of the world, in general, you have conservative forces battling the liberal forces. In some settings, like in your country, they've agreed upon the rule of the game, which is democratic contestation. In our country, the rule of the game has always been the violence, and particularly when in 1960s, even before that in 50s, we had these young students who went out to two different poles. Some went to Egypt, got Islamist education, and I'm conscious using Islamist, not Islamic education, because they basically got the idea of how to mobilize and mobilize violently to overthrow the government. And some went to the former Soviet Union and the countries aligned with it, where they got the idea of a Marxist revolution, but in a Stalinist fashion. When they came back, and people like Ghani, who went then to liberal university in Lebanon and then to the US, and they were more aligned with that government. What I'm trying to say is that the mobilization that took place then, we are still paying the price for that mobilization because it was predicated on violence. The problem in 2011 was that not only that the leadership was failing in conducting the day-to-day government services, but at the same time, they failed to mobilize effectively against the Taliban. And when I say Taliban, that is only symbolic of a much larger ecosystem, social ecosystem of an Islamist movement that has been there. And if you look at the history of Taliban, I've done a paper on this. The Deobandi Madrasa, the very first one that was created in India some 300 years ago. So and if from sociological point of view, because I'm a sociologist too, they use physical spaces like mosques and madrasas very effectively and getting across their propaganda and getting more and more people on their side. And that's what they did very effectively. Just last point, I had a classmate in 2007 who had never been to Afghanistan, a British guy, had never dealt with that conflict. In our first class in our MA course, we were asked to do conflict analysis of a country we had never been to, and he chose Afghanistan. His conclusion was that basically there is still a civil war already in 2007, and the only thing that the West has done is that it has heavily funded the side against the Taliban. That's why they're winning right now. And that once that funding phased out, then obviously Taliban had the upper hand in terms of resource mobilization. They had the resources and they had the effectiveness of using those resources more effectively than the previous government. But Ghani and people like Ghani, and people don't mention President Karzai that much, which is a shame because he stayed back and everybody is cutting him a slack. The main problem President Karzai created was that he failed to instill confidence in electoral process. He used elections. We have a mutual friend, Amin and I, who used to be the CEO of the Election Commission. He would tell you that President Karzai would tell you, elect this person. Use any mechanism, but make sure that this person comes to power, you know? And that basically the electoral process we could use to mobilize for a more liberal Afghanistan, but we failed to mobilize them. And that was also the reason why President Ghani came to power. He had zero chance of coming to power the first time in 2014. President Dr. Abdullah had clearly won the election. We had all seen the figures from in the first round. He had gotten 57% of the votes. But because Karzai didn't want Abdullah to be the president, he wanted a Pashtun to be the president, and then he got Ghani that posting. And because Ghani was propelled in a position that he was not prepared for, though he had kept saying that he had prepared for this moment his entire life, but he was very ill prepared. And I'll give you one illustration. He asked me once when I was his chief of staff to conduct surveys in 20 districts, and within 10 days. And I said, it's bizarre. First of all, I don't have the human resources. Even if I did in 10 days, it's impossible. We had a clash on this for days. Finally, one day he gives me a call and says, I have invited like 20 European ambassadors and we need to work on a presentation. So we worked on the presentation, and then he tells me while working on the presentation, so the survey we conducted, this is the conclusion, this is the conclusion. And I said, we didn't conduct a survey. He said, yes, I did. And then later on, I found out that he had asked just two guys to come in, fill out some forms, those survey forms, and then he had drawn his conclusions from those forms. And for me as a researcher, this was ethically the worst possible thing you could do. But with so much confidence, he presented this to those ambassadors, and they didn't even question it. They didn't even say what was the methodology, how many people did you deploy, where did you deploy them, where did you get the resources. They just blindly fell for it because Ghani was a very strong orator in English, and because he knew the jargon, he knew the lingo, what kind of language you should use to get the attention. And when he landed in Argan, our presidential palace, he did exactly the same thing. He was so out of touch with everything. When you mentioned his national security advisor, they were all giving him wrong information day in and day out. 2 months before the collapse, I had already seen this. I kept asking the office of Mohib, where is the plan? What is the plan? Why are the districts falling? And they would always tell me, well, we have a plan. But when I asked for the plan, they never presented a plan. So that's when I switched off. I was like, oh, this is really bad. So it was a collective failure in terms of not having enough people buy into the idea of liberal democratic Afghanistan, but also because the leadership is the central figure in mobilization. Obviously, the failure of the leaders, because they never figured out what was the rule of the game, the main structure within which everybody was comfortable contesting politics in a peaceful manner.
Thank you, Malaiz, for your very insightful articulation of the utter chaos and confusion that you saw, right from the start of the transition government. And you've obviously kept in touch with the happenings there, and it just seems so bizarre, Amin, to witness, for those of you who witnessed this from the inside, to see, to even be able to tell this story, because it just looks unbelievable. Here are senior leaders, like President Karzai and subsequently President Ghani, who do not have, the sort of intellectual wisdom to actually build institutions. So they were not building robust institutions. They were actually fixing the game of democracy, in a way that ultimately was just weakening Afghanistan without really anybody seeing it. And what Malaiz says is that nobody was questioning. So in that context, is it really apt to say Taliban takeover, or do you think there was a design in this takeover, that institutions never really got set up in the way that would serve the Afghan people and help navigate their destiny, but it was set up to serve? It almost seems like it was set up to fail at some point in time.
Well, look, it was both. Sorry, was the question directed to...
It was the question was directed at Amin, but after that you can come in, Malaiz, as well.
Actually, in my understanding, I don't think that they were smart enough to design it for this day, from the earlier, because no one, it's not very rational that people who are having the power should think from the beginning that we are going to hand over our power and authority to somebody else. It's not happening like in the world of politics, in my opinion. But what I think is that the loopholes that were created as a result of all these misleadership and lack of a very organized and coordinated political leadership of Afghanistan, based on the for a bigger vision of a liberal Afghanistan and a democratic Afghanistan, we were not clear enough. The political leadership of Afghanistan were not clear enough that what kind of Afghanistan we want at the end of the day. So they were they were moving towards different directions. Everybody, all these political leaders were going towards, different directions. That's why I think all these loopholes give an insight to the strategic thinkers who are behind Pakistan. They saw all those loopholes, and I think that they use very much, this opportunity to devise their own strategy that how to overthrow this government very easily, in my opinion. So it was all whatever actions they were doing for the past 20 years, whether it was done by the government of President Karzai or President Ghani or the international community. So they were just, watching very carefully and observing that all those areas where these two governments were very much vulnerable. And then they used it very, smart, and they knew that how we can overthrow this government very easily. So any action that, for example, the other day, Amrullah Saleh was actually giving an example of of actually Bajwa coming to him and actually telling him, okay, that I don't want to discuss with you that, Pakistan is not supporting Taliban or supporting Taliban. I'm here to actually confess that with you. And then I tell you that from now on, we are not doing it. Oh man. So, the VP was this naive that he was thinking that they are coming to them, disclosing, and this is an honest disclosure and confession. And from now on, they are going to change their behavior. So, imagine that the VP who thinks that he is the mastermind of intelligence of Afghanistan. So he was thinking like that. And this happens like when you do an analysis of all these political leadership. I don't think they were capable to run a country, a fragile country like Afghanistan. And one more thing that I want to add, that the role of, we cannot ignore the role of geopolitics in context of Afghanistan, because I think a lot of countries who were there to support democracy and so on, in reality, they were not supporting all these democratic efforts. That's why, because I know that if you make Afghanistan out of all these extremism and violence and all these things, then it means that you're destroying a very strong and free belt, and to secure the Gulf and all these oil and so on. So once you have a free Afghanistan, a liberal Afghanistan, an educated Afghanistan. So it means that you are destroying a very strong belt to restrain Russia and China. So, but they were using the famous quotation of General Ziaul Haq that, they don't let the water to boil and keep it warm. So it was like that. I think, the players in Afghanistan's case were not very honest with the people of Afghanistan.
So, Amin, you were referring to General Bajwa of Pakistan meeting Vice President Saleh and basically telling him, look, we have a hands-off policy from Afghanistan. We are not really doing any interference, so don't worry about it. And you're saying that at that point in time, he believed him. And he's supposed to be, someone who was also heading intelligence operations, Vice President Saleh, for Afghanistan, and that how naive was he to believe General Bajwa that Pakistan would, maintain a mid path. At this particular anecdote, when you listen to this, what do you have to say to this?
One of the things that I've been trying to tell people is that the process of state formation in our region, particularly with the border disputes that you Indians have with Chinese, you have with the Pakistanis, we have with the Pakistanis, the process of state formation, if you look at the Westphalian state, basically having fixed borders is one of the main principles, right? So that process has not yet been completed. And that's why you have these socio-political structures that take over the functions of the state. And Pakistan is a very good example where if Bajwa came to me, I would never believe it, because I know there's a symbiotic relationship between the Islamists and these socially liberal but politically totalitarian parts of the Pakistani society. Obviously, the Pakistani generals would have scotch, on the rocks with you. Socially, they're liberal. Their daughters will have boyfriends. They will have sex before marriage and all that. But when it comes to politics, they would behave in a very totalitarian manner, would not allow people to decide who comes to power. But then they've created these spaces in Pakistan. If you go, for example, the example of the Lal Mosque and the Lal Masjid in Islamabad is telling. It is its own sovereignty. It has its own sovereignty. It's sovereign in its own right. Because if the Pakistan military goes after the Islamists, then that's That's it for Pakistan. One of the reasons why the talks with TTP are failing is that TTP is so deeply ingrained in the Pakistani society, particularly this Islamist side, that it cannot be extricated through talks. And so I would never believe it. To your previous question, whether this was just simply a matter of crumbling state in the face of a very um, weak challenge, or was it really Taliban being very powerful? Let me just use the principle of relativity here, because previously when then they took Kabul, they failed, and so miserably failed to take the northeast of the country from Masood and his allies. And the reason for that was that Masood was mobilizing very effectively, as effectively as the Taliban were doing. But the Taliban back then were not as strong as the Taliban today. So it is relative. At the same time, the state that collapsed and Panjshir was taken, and all the places where Masood was very powerful in the past, was also because the mobilization that Masood was doing, it never took place in the last 20 years. His disciples failed at that. So it was both much stronger Taliban. Obviously, in the past 20 years, they got the experience of fighting a very effective war against a very powerful enemy, and then transfer of knowledge from the Pakistani army, transfer of all the information and technology from the Pakistan military, but at the same time, not having people in this Republican government to realize this and prepare effectively for it. I'll give you one illustration. Dr. Farooq Wardak, who was my boss in the Constitutional Commission, back then he would tell me, you know what, don't listen to President Karzai. He's not the president of this country. Lakhdar Brahimi was the special representative of the UN. He's the president of the country. And he would suck up to the Americans so much that when things would come to shove, I would be the one telling the Americans, no, we're not doing it this way. We're doing it this way. And he would chicken out. And then he would be begging me behind the doors, please, don't be so harsh with the Americans. But obviously, when he came back to Afghanistan, the first thing he told the Taliban, he's come back now, was that congratulations on winning the jihad and defeating the infidels and so on and so forth. So if you had people with that kind of motivation in the government, in the driving seat, obviously you're not going to win it, because they had zero motivation of waging that war. And Ghani was very similar. I mean, he's trying to portray himself as the intellectual of Islam, as an Islamic leader. He never was. He would always lie about praying, he would always lie to people about the research he had done on Islam. He had never done, he barely spoke Pashto, let alone Arabic, He would recite all the verses wrong. He wouldn't even be able to do the very simple things when it comes to the religion. So it was both. So that's why I'm using the principle of relativity. A much stronger Taliban, a much weaker opponent, and that resulted in the 11 days collapse.
So both of you are telling me that President Ghani was not the person he projected himself to be.
Oh no, he was Trump. He was Trump. He was and I don't know where you're leaning. He's Moody. Moody at least had a gradual going through every step of politics. He was a political worker, but in terms of his projection of himself, he was a Trump, and nobody in politics, coming in, lying about everything, and in some ways very successful in mobilization. And his recent efforts to try to reinvent himself. Before I go there, what Ghani was really aiming to do was, because he was never born in the US, he wanted to be called Mr. President. He couldn't be the president of the US because he was not born in the US. So when he came to Afghanistan, he wanted to become the president at least once, so that when he goes back to Washington, D.C., everybody would call him still the Mr. President. Now, after his escape, he cannot project that. He cannot even go to the US, and he is suffering because of that. So what he's trying to do is to reinvent himself. That's why he has set up this new TV channel, a web-based TV channel, and he did this interview. But what he doesn't understands is that he is very effective in communicating to certain constituency in Afghanistan, but he's failing to actually connect with the one that he really wants to connect with, which is a US-based constituency. So he's been effective in that, like Imran Khan. Imran Khan, what people fail about understanding of Imran Khan is that he's not one of those previous prime ministers that were handpicked by the Pakistan military and installed, and when they were gone, there was no one backing them. He has conducted mobilization. He has millions of people looking up. Ghani has done the same thing. The only issue that failed him was that he was coward. He didn't stand his ground. If he had stood his ground, there would be people around him actually protecting him, but not the ones who were already around him, like literally people who didn't know him. I spent hours with people who are so steadfast supporting him, and they don't even know him. They've never met him, and I'm like, I've lived in his house, I've seen the but they're still supporting him. They believe in him.
So, Amin, will it be very harsh to call Mr. Ghani a fraud?
Actually, in my opinion, when he was planning to run for the office, once I was asked by somebody from an embassy, and they said, we think he's running for office. And I said, I think he shouldn't be running for office because he's not someone who could put enough effort to, work for Afghanistan the way that we want, like us young, and the way we had the vision. Yes, he was not the right person to run the country. He was not actually capable. He didn't have the belief that the president of Afghanistan should have had it. He didn't think about public good. The only thing was that, as Malaiz said, he was a power thirst. Like, he was thirsty to be called like as Mr. President. He was thirsty to be called as commander-in-chief. And the way that he was always saying this in his speeches, that, I'm the commander-in-chief, I am the commander-in-chief. Yes, but he was a failed commander-in-chief, in my opinion, and he was not able to save that position. This was a very big responsibility for him. It was, the cloth was very big in his body. And I think that's why he could have once long ago, I also told another person that it is good to keep him as an advisor, close to president, but only get those advices that you think is good for the country. But he shouldn't be on the driving seat because he doesn't have the heart that is needed for Afghanistan. Like, anyone who's becoming the president of Afghanistan or the leader of Afghanistan should have a very big heart, a very, very big heart to accommodate even very, very small minorities and all these differences that we have, difference in terms of language, in terms of belief, in terms of, religion, even in terms of, difference of opinion, lifestyle. For example, we are not representing the full Afghanistan. So we need somebody who could accommodate with a big heart all people of Afghanistan, regardless of any kind of discrimination. And he had discrimination.
So he was discriminatory in nature. He did not know how to pray. He didn't know the religious texts. He would often quote the verses from the religious text wrong. He was pro certain kinds of Afghan, and he was anti other kinds of Afghan. So he was just not the right person in office. And it brings to bear another question at this point in time. And both of you, please take turns to answer. So the playbook never changed, right? There was a playbook in the Cold War days about Afghanistan being used, as really the field for one of the most, brutal Cold War wars. Countries took sides. The West took side with Taliban, literally created Taliban, and the then Soviet Union, Iran, and India supported Northern Alliance, and then you had the breakup of Soviet Union, and Afghanistan went into a crisis. There was internal warfare, civil war, etc. And you come back to the present day, and it just still seems that the playbook remains. It's just that some people have switched sides, but the playbook, continues to remain. And in that sense, there's only one character in the playbook that remains constant, and that's Pakistan. In whichever situation, it has always had an important role to play. Would it be fair to say that this current Taliban takeover of Afghanistan is really a Pakistani takeover of Afghanistan?
Amin, do you want to go or should I go first?
You go first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the playbook is that we, as I said earlier, that you have these resilient processes. Sociologists call them structures. So basically you have the conservative forces and you have the liberal forces, and they don't really respect the borders. So they don't see themselves as confined to either Pakistan or Afghanistan particularly, even but the other countries in the region too. Like if you talk to an ordinary Taliban member, he would tell you, of course, we are taking over the Central Asia. We are helping our brethren there. We are taking over China, let alone Kashmir and so on and so forth. But when it comes to Pakistan, whether it's a constant or not, I never use these generic terms, Pakistan, the US, India. So there are many liberal forces in Pakistan, extremely effective. You have the Pashtun Tahfuz movement, managing to bring tens of thousands of people to their protests. They've put up such an amazing fight against the Taliban in North and South Waziristan that it's just unbelievable, and the Pakistani army too. So you have, again, these social liberal generals who've aligned with the Islamists. The Islamists are aggrieved because the West used to be their main sponsors. Even hundreds of years ago, the way the British behaved in the subcontinent and also vis-a-vis Afghanistan was that they would deploy mullahs, they would deploy peers. We have Peer Gilani's family. They were never there. They would even, if you go to their house today, the first thing they would show you is the picture of their house in Baghdad, and they were transported all the way from Iraq to Afghanistan. Or the Mujahideen family, they were Indians, but they were brought into Afghanistan. So the British Empire instrumentalized the Islamists, and Islamists fed on that against the Russia and then later on Soviet Union. And when the Americans come into this region, they simply took over that function with the help of the Pakistani generals. And the Pakistani generals stayed aligned with the US, but at the same time with the main Islamist force that could be used against Afghans, which was the Taliban. So they're allies of both in this war. And they kept telling the Americans for years, these are our own people. Like Rafael, when she was the Undersecretary of State, this is the force for stability, the only force for stability. But what they failed was realizing that if you kill an American, that will have implications. So, and then the Afghans, and to a certain extent the Indians, they used the space that was created very effectively, and having a strong lobby, much stronger than the Pakistanis had in the West. So now our lobby is much stronger, and it's not mainly Afghans, it's the non-Afghans against the Pakistanis. But the Pakistanis then turned their attention to the region. So they got the region to cooperate. If you remember, when the Taliban took over, just after the takeover of Taliban, the first trip Imran Khan made was to Tajikistan, because they're so scared of even the tiniest country in the region that may help a resistance force. So they're really, for now, content that the region, particularly Iran and India, are not challenging them. And there's no space through which the resistance can connect with any of these countries. But we also know for sure that the resistance is getting support. It is shady for now where they are getting it from. And if you look at Panjshir, because it's the valley and then you have the high ground. The high ground is still, apart from using drones, the Taliban, and initially when Pakistanis directly bombed the resistance, So the high ground is still in the hands of the resistance, so-called National Resistance Front. The Taliban are only, and I'm talking to people from Panjshir, they have this marketplace that they are holding. And this marketplace, even the market is open only for an hour every day. So they're failing at what they were doing in 1990s in terms of ensuring their writ on the space that they have captured, the Taliban. Today, they killed Maulay Mahdi, who was Hazara Taliban commander, who challenged them in Balkhab. So things are crumbling, but they're crumbling at a much slower pace because you don't have a very strong challenger. Had you had a stronger challenger, Taliban would have been in much more pain right now. And this is a key question now. Who would be the potential challenger? How this challenger would come into being? What kind of behavior the challenger would have? And then the concept of Pakistan, as you mentioned it, you can actually ally with so many Pakistani forces from political parties to social movements, and then have a really strong challenge in Pakistan to the Pakistani generals.
Amin, your take?
Yes, I echo what actually Malaiz said, that we don't have like on the ground, and even, all these regions, they have, I think, the past challenge of Taliban, like in the role of Pakistan, like alerted all these countries around Afghanistan. So they are now playing very much carefully, because they are also, when it comes to working with Taliban, in terms of Pakistan, is very much like mixed of, a Taliban ideology and so on, because they are having like a deep state, who is actually running the actual strategic depth of Pakistan. But when it comes to all these like Russia, Central Asia, even India, they are not willing to support the resistance, like, as they were doing it during Ahmad Shah Massoud. It is like very different, because they also realize that if we go like full-fledged to support the resistance and so on, and then they might be facing a consequence of a larger war in their own countries then. So the risk of, confronting with the Taliban is much more higher than 20 years ago, because Taliban is now like, they are having a lot of weapons, like, worth for billions, billions of dollars. So they are in a much more stronger position. That's why I see that even India, who was traditionally always in support of the Afghan governments, the legitimate governments were running Kabul. I think that nowadays they are coming like, forward to speak with the Taliban and see how, in order to at least to get them, and seeking ways to get them in confidence, in my opinion. But I don't think it will be successful, because for these countries, for Pakistan, it's okay to work with extremism and with Taliban, with all these terrorist groups and so on, because Pakistan know how to play with them. But for all these other countries, I say that it will be playing with fire.
So am I to understand that short of calling Pakistan the de facto ruler in Afghanistan, both of you are actually saying that behind the scenes, it's Pakistan that's controlling the levers of power or action, from Kabul? Are you all saying that, or you're not saying that?
Well, it's more nuanced, more complex than that, because there are elements within Taliban who are aggrieved by the actions of certain Pakistanis, General Qaid Hamid, I mean, he was recently transferred back to Punjab. So obviously there are people like Sarajuddin Haqqani who wanted really, he worked hard to make sure that TTP reaches a deal with Faiz Hamid. But then he also was very categorical in telling Faiz Hamid that we cannot just hand over all these. These are our own people. We cannot hand them over to you to prosecute. But then you have elements within the Taliban, the so-called diplomats who are sitting in Doha, Mullah Brother, and so on and so forth. A journalist actually was telling me that off the record, Suhail Shaheen, who is one of the key people in Doha office, he told him that the way we are moving forward, it's suicide. I'm not moving my family from Doha to Afghanistan because this is not going to sustain. So there are people who are against Pakistan, and even in the previous Taliban administration, you had people who were staunchly against Pakistan. You had this guy called Mullah Rakati from Zabul, he was the corps commander in Nangarhar province. He was so anti-Pakistani that even some of our politicians who used to say they were anti-Pakistani, they were not that anti-Pakistani. But the problem Taliban have is, and that is the key now, they're running out of bullets, literally. They're running out of fuel. They don't want to wage a war because then they can use their resources that they're getting from customs and so on and so forth for providing services to their own fighters, not others. But because there's a war going on in Panjshir, Takhar, and so on and so forth, and the economy is crumbling, the Pakistanis are bankrupt. So the Pakistanis cannot provide them with bullets and fuel and so on and so forth. They've been trying, they cannot do it. So that's also a point of contention now. They're like, okay, so what should we do? So that is the main challenge. And the Pakistanis at least pretend to be respecting the Taliban. And that is another trick that they're using. So I think on policy, like making sure that Pakistani state is not threatened, so on and so forth, the Taliban are aligned with the Pakistanis, but Pakistanis are not calling all the shots. They are the main ally. They are like, if there's a red line for Pakistan, the Taliban would never cross it, but they would also never accept the Durand line, which is a key condition of Pakistanis for any Afghan state, any Afghan government. But Taliban are not those people. They will never do it.
Okay, it's time to gaze into the crystal ball, so to say. Amin, I'll start with you. There is already lots of fractures and frictions, that is already visible, even within the Islamists. The Taliban and ISIS are at loggerheads. They seem to be fighting each other. There are other groups that have come in and vying for stakeholder status. Within this very complex set of things that are currently happening in Afghanistan, including the resistance from NRF. I mean, when you look into the crystal ball, what do you see, in the year ahead? What kind of situation do you foresee?
Actually, it's a very interesting question that what will happen, in the next 12 months or a year. In my opinion, it's hard to predict it at this point, but it really, really depends, in my opinion, on the role of the key players, key international players, and the regional players, that how they are going to deal with Afghanistan and Taliban. It's very important, because I was expecting that by the time this deputy of Osama, who was killed in Kabul, I was expecting that the international community will take it very hard on them. And then, everyone will say that, but it looks to me a little bit, shady, that they are not even giving it enough coverage, that he was in Kabul, he was killed there. And so it means that there are some negotiations going on behind the curtain between Taliban and all these other governments, including the regional powers, including India. So it depends that how how well they actually play, you know, in the coming months, and how well they negotiate. For now, they have like a few bargaining, items in their hand, including the schools. The girls' school, and allowing women to work, and so on. So it means that it will certainly depend at how they are going to play it while they are negotiating the deal with the West, especially the region, like including Pakistan. They will not come and recognize them, alone. So they know the consequences of recognition of Taliban as they learned it before, like 20 years ago. So they are playing it very carefully, including China and Russia, but they are still waiting. So it means that the US and the West is still, they are as the world leaders. So whatever decision is coming out of the US towards the Taliban, all these countries will follow in the coming 12 months. And when it comes to the resistance, I'm not very hopeful that they are working very, strategic, and with all these, learning from the previous mistakes. I don't see very strong and very capable leaders down there too, that who could mobilize, the resistance as effective as 20% of Ahmad Shah Massoud. And I don't see the motivation among the leaders of Northern Alliance and those who are against Taliban, like very much aligned with each other, because most of them are like much more into their own businesses. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, I think I will go through the checklist of the Taliban promises. The checklist, the first one is obviously no security threat to any country in the world. And that is the promise that they've made not only to the US, but also to the region. And they're already failing in it. You already have the Daesh throwing missiles from Afghan territory into Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. They're already failing it because you have Zawahiri in Afghanistan. And I don't think it was by choice. By choice, Mullah Brother and the so-called Taliban diplomats would have never wanted to stay there. But as I said, the symbiotic relationship is such that they had to host him. They had no other choice. There would be friction if they hadn't hosted him. Their own fighters would fight against him if they hadn't hosted him. So they're failing there. For the region, obviously democracy was bad because this is mainly a democratic region. Michael E. Brown has a beautiful book on causes of conflict, in which he says bad neighborhood is one of the reasons why you have a civil war in a country. So we're already in a bad neighborhood, an autocratic neighborhood. So everybody's happy there's no democracy in Afghanistan. But at the same time, Taliban were, at least one of the promises they've made is that there would be stability, like in the Chinese sense, in Afghanistan, and that dissent would be crushed so effectively that no one would dare not only challenge the Taliban, but also countries in the region. They're failing in that too. Obviously, you have not only Daesh. Daesh a few days ago killed one of the key ideologues of Taliban, but also because there are voices within the region, like in Iran. There's a strong, very strong constituency saying, no, we have to now be on the side of the opposition. And these voices, Turkey will go the same direction. The Central Asia will go towards the same direction because Taliban is a convenient option for those in power right now, but they know in the longer run, they're not their natural allies. India has made a grave mistake in trying to engage with the Taliban and not engage with others. India had a golden opportunity to engage with no one, but use non-violent action and doing nothing else, setting up information channels on how nonviolent action can be used not only against terrorists, against oppressive states, but also in the long run against ensuring peace and lasting peace. It's the country of Gandhi, and you expect India to be able to realize this, but it hasn't anyhow. But at the same time, setting up trainings. I was training nonviolent activists just before the collapse. The women that are right now protesting, they become such a headache for the Taliban. It's unimaginable for Taliban that women would come out. And just imagine if they have the numbers. Just imagine instead of 50 women, you have like 10,000 women on the streets. Taliban would pack up and go to their own villages. Literally, that's how it's going to pan out. The other promise that they've made is that we are not Taliban of 90s. We are Taliban 2.0. So we are going to respect rights. They're failing there too. They're not respecting rights of minorities, of women, of marginalized groups. That would backfire. You would have a lot of ethnic friction. So the way I see it is that at one point, because they are failing on all these fronts, particularly the US and their constituencies within US, like the intelligence agencies of the US, would throw some money at someone that would not only look at as kind of surveillance of Taliban actions, but also use the money to challenge the Taliban. And I can tell you that even if, for example, the NRF gets $10 million a year, they were getting only $500,000 a year from the US in 1990s. Taliban would be in a situation unimaginable. So we are going towards a conflict. It could be extremely violent, a civil war sort of situation, unless we create constituencies from now on. That's one of the things I'm trying to create. I'm trying to also connect with Ahmad Massoud to tell him, look, your cause is right. The only issue is the way you are trying to advance it, which is through violence. Use nonviolent action. It's the most effective way. Look at the statistics. Read Erica Chenoweth and Maria Gestefan's book, How Civil Resistance Works. The success rate of nonviolent action, and we saw recently in a country like Sri Lanka, is much higher, and not only direct action, like by protesting and so on and so forth, but also indirect action, creating alternative institutions. Taliban itself is the creation of alternative institutions of madrasas. In Pakistan, what Bacha Khan did was he created then his own network of Azad schools. And you see people like Manzoor Pashtun, people like Mohsen Dawar, the Amin Ashraf Party, these are all the offshoots. These are all the descendants of those institutions. So in order to have organic local challengers to the Taliban who could potentially then come to power and create a government that is unlike the government that collapsed. Because these guys, they were still interested. One of the beauties of nonviolence is that it provides simplicity. And simplicity means you don't become corrupt. You don't need to be corrupt because you don't dwell on worldly stuff. Whereas violence creates corruption. It's intrinsically corrupt. Because all the people who are trying to fight, we had this commander in the Ghazni province. He was called to the parliament, and he was scolded why his soldiers were smoking hashish. He said, "What kind of people do you want me to employ to fight? These are the kind of people you employ to fight." And during the last Taliban era, there was a huge problem because all the people who were fighting against Massoud in the northern part of Kabul, they were all drug addicts. And Taliban were obviously saying, no, we don't want drugs, but they had to use these drug addicts against Massoud's forces. What I'm trying to say is that violence is intrinsically corrupt, intrinsically corrosive, is not an alternative. Once again, imagine for time that you have these people back in power. Again, it will be back and forth. You have the Taliban, you have them. But in order to have lasting peace, not only for Afghanistan, but for the entire region, you have to have peaceful alternatives. And I think mobilization along those lines will happen. My crystal ball is there is going to be a huge conflict. Taliban are failing, but it comes back to us Afghans, how we try to streamline the support of different countries. And one of the things, I was at the European Parliament last month, and they were like, there are too many voices, number one. They all criticize us, Afghan voices. No one gives a solution. You're the only one who has given us a template. This is a template I present to them. So they asked me to come in again, develop this further, and then present it to the full committee of the parliament. So it's voices like mine and Amin's and so on and so forth who can inform the policy. It's voices like mine talking to you right now, trying to inform the policy of Modi government, saying, look, you're going around this totally wrong. You are the country of nonviolence, and nonviolence is not pacifism. It's not being sitting around and doing nothing. It's action oriented. And look at the life of Gandhi. All he did was always action. One of the reasons why Bacha Khan Gandhi's families never liked their own fathers was because they were so much into their politics. Anyhow, so this is a huge discussion, but Taliban or not Taliban of 1990s, they cannot project themselves as the force of stability. They are failing, and it will have grave consequences for the region and the country.
That's a wonderful way to end this interview, Malaiz, and I'm very taken up with this insight that you shared, that violence is inherently corrupt and therefore corrosive, and the only way to counteract violence is to use other forms of resistance that grows, that takes root within communities and the civil society in a way that bring the holders of power to some kind of accountability that is rooted in non-violence. And on that note, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Malaiz. Thank you, Amin, for this lovely discussion. We hope that this discussion is just the start of several that people will have on how do we break this oppressive cycle of violence in Afghanistan and provide opportunities for people in Afghanistan to really harness both the science and tech side of 21st century, but also harness development and sustainability and livelihoods in a way that makes the country break out of long years of violence and give people a chance to fully participate in the global society. Thank you so much, both of you. Hope to catch up again very soon.
Thank you, Shashi. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hafiz, Amin.
Khudafis.
Tashakkur.